Thanks, Anna. And thanks to the Fourth Space for hosting us the entire week. So we're starting the fourth conversation of 12 this week with Krista Byers-Heinlein. This will be followed by a conversation with Tandang Vu, and afterwards Carly Zitter and Isabella Richmond. But first, Krista, hi.
Hi, Patrick.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So Krista, I'll introduce you first and then we can dive in. You're a full professor in psychology. Congratulations.
Thank
that was
you.
relatively recent. Yeah.
Yes, just over a year.
Yeah. A CURC, that's a Concordia University Research Chair in Bilingualism and Open Science. So the open science aspect was added because you were a CURC previously.
Yes, my previous CURC was just in bilingualism,
Right.
and kind of over the course of that chair, this sort of new piece came to my research program, which was open science. So I decided to really more formally add that.
Okay, and we'll dive into that in a moment. Krista's groundbreaking work explores the foundations of bilingual acquisition in infants and toddlers, and the impact of such acquisition on broader cognitive and social development. So you're a founding member of the governing board of Many Babies, a multi-lab collaboration in which over 200 infant research labs worldwide are engaging in large-scale collaboration. So I'll be curious to hear about that. I'm sure we can link that to the open science aspect, especially with the crisis of replication. Yeah, right. I'm anticipating. So more than virtually any other scholar of her generation, Krista Byers-Heinlein's research has changed the landscape of how we understand and study early bilingualism. So we're very fortunate to have you with us today. You were at UBC, University of British Columbia, beforehand for your PhD, and you've been at Concordia for about a dozen years?
That's right, 12 years.
Yeah, 12 years. And I won't go over the list of Krista's funding. It's incredibly impressive, but I could summarize, it's been $5.6 million so far at Concordia in large individual grants and some operating funds as well. And you're working with, in your lab, you currently have 4 postdocs, 5 grad students, and 6 to 9 undergraduate students, depending on the period of the year.
That's right,
That's
but
a lot.
I will say a couple of those graduate students just recently defended their PhD, so our numbers have gone down a little bit.
Right, but I'm sure you're waiting for more to come in.
Yes.
Yeah. Great, and on the publication side, just maybe one number in 2022. So this year, so far 14 peer-reviewed publications. I was going to ask you if you ever sleep.
Well, I will say that perhaps all or nearly all of those publications are co-authored with my trainees, and I think that's something we're going to be talking about later today. So if I was doing that alone, I couldn't sleep. But collaboratively, it makes a big difference.
Well, how does that work? So in the sciences, there's a great tradition of collaborative writing, which to researchers outside of that field, we don't always get exactly how that works. Could you talk about that and what mentorship aspect is involved, and how do you navigate these waters, which can, I guess, be murky at times?
Yeah, for sure. So collaborative writing is really a core of my research activities and a core of the kind of training that I do in my lab. So as in many of the sciences, almost all of our publications are co-authors. So with myself, 1 or more trainees, and sometimes other collaborators as well. And we can have, 2, 3, 4, 5, and in the case of Many Babies, hundreds of authors on a paper. So, for those maybe in disciplines where co-authorship is not as common, you might wonder, how exactly do you write together? So for us, it really depends who I'm writing with. So with a trainee, once we know what we're writing about, and most of our papers are empirical papers, so we've conceptualized a research question, hypotheses, a research study, the methods, we've collected the data, we've analyzed the data. So we already know a lot about what is going to go into that writing. And there's a reasonably clear formula for scientific journal articles, right? So you have an introduction where you lay out about the field, the question, you have the methods, the results, and the discussion. So it's a consistent structure. Trainees are usually familiar with that coming out of undergrad. Undergraduates are becoming familiar with that, and I co-author with them as well. But usually I have students sort of take the first step. So depending on their level, it might be writing an outline. It might, if they're a little bit more advanced, it might be giving a shot at the methods section, which is, they know what they did in their study, so they write it down. So they usually bring something to me, and I will give them feedback. We actually often co-author things on Google Documents. So with those Google Docs, there's real-time feedback. We don't have to be emailing things back and forth. We have one version. So, depending on their level, I'll give them different types of feedback. So for some students, that might be literally rewriting some of their sentences, if they're at that level. Others, I'm able to give comments about where things are clear, unclear. Sometimes I write certain sections and they write certain sections. And the paper eventually comes together, and I always make sure to give it sort of a final read through and stamp of approval before we agree this is ready to leave the lab or ready to submit this to colleagues to read or submit it for publication.
And so with 14 papers in 2022, you must have been working on many papers simultaneously. How do you keep that separate, or does it all converge because it's emerging from your lab?
Yeah, that's a great question. So absolutely, it's a lot of papers to juggle. So there's often multiple papers ongoing at a time. Of course, there are aspects of them that are related to each other, but typically they're all based on different research projects. So I do have to think about, okay, well, this is what we did in this study. Here are our hypotheses. I sometimes have to ask my students to remind me, what we had done. But yeah, it is a lot to work on. But at the same time, there's a back and forth. So a student might be working on it for a while. They'll send it to me. Can you give this a read? I try to read it within about a week if I can. Give those comments, that feedback, send it back to them. So there's rarely more than one or two or sometimes three papers literally sitting in my inbox at the same time.
And you mentioned the Many Babies project where you had up to 100 co-authors.
Yes.
Can you contextualize what the Many Babies project is, and so we can understand how that's even possible?
So I mean, Many Babies is a whole new way of doing science, and it's been, I could say, really one of the most exciting things in my career, and maybe the most important thing in terms of the real change that it's making in how science is being done. So Many Babies got started about in 2015, as a small group of scientists sort of talking about the field, and you alluded to the replication crisis.
Right.
And this is something that's been going on in psychology, my field, but also in a lot of other fields where, we sort of realized, wow, these findings that we had, sometimes when we go back and try them again, try to do that study again, we're not getting the same result. Why is this? Replication is a cornerstone of science. We should be, you do the experiment, you should be able to get it at the same time. So why were these studies not replicating? And one thing that we've sort of realized is that some of the research practices that we had were maybe questionable or suboptimal. So there are many, many of these that have been discovered. One example in my field, I study infants, is our typical samples, how many infants we study in an experiment typically has been 16 to 24 infants. Turns out from a statistical perspective, that is way too few. So we're trying to draw conclusions based on these groups. But it turns out, one baby's fussy this day, the other's very attentive. There's a lot of variability, and you need a large sample to kind of figure out what's going out through that variability. And we just didn't have it and didn't even quite realize that we didn't have it. So sample size was one issue. Another issue was that scientists were analyzing their data and kind of looking at it and I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that, what works, let's see. That seems to make a lot of sense, see what you can find. But and when we talk to the statisticians about this, well, it turns out that it kind of can lead you down paths that might be wrong. So you face all these different decisions when you're analyzing, oh no, this baby was too fussy, or that was doing something weird, I'll throw out this data, I'm gonna analyze it this way or that way. You end up at a certain place, but that might not really represent the data in a good way. You might be kind of taking advantage of some chance, even if you don't mean to.
Those fussy babies would have been useful in the study.
Yes, or what if you define whether a baby was fussy depending on whether they did what you thought they should do? That one's the real problem. So we sort of realized that a lot of these practices were causing problems in the field. And that's why things weren't replicating. So if you got a result only because you analyzed it this very specific way and excluded these particular babies, when someone else goes to do it, they're not going to find that same result because yours maybe was a bit based on chance in that case. So that sort of started a whole revolution, or a renaissance even in psychology, to improve our research practices, which links up with open science, which we're going to talk about. But Many Babies is actually part of open science. So the idea of Many Babies was, wow, in my lab, I can only test 16 babies, like it takes so long, but what if you also tested 16 in your lab, and you tested 16 in your lab, and they tested 16? Wow, and what if we got babies not just from Canada, but we got babies from Japan, and babies from Switzerland, and babies from England? What if we could all together get thousands of babies together? And not only that, what if, when we designed the study, and in the literature, the scientific, we argue about, well, you should have done it like this. Why did you show the babies these pictures? It should have been brighter. It should have been dimmer. The voice should have been a female voice or a male voice. Or, there's many methodological issues you could argue about. Well, what if before the study, we had to all sit down together and agree what a really good study was going to be?
Right.
What if we all hashed it out together before we started doing it? And so that's part of the Many Babies process. So in Many Babies, we together collaboratively decide on a research question. What are we going to do? So the very first Many Baby study we wanted to do something that we thought was a real phenomenon, right? We wanted our study to succeed, just to prove, like, okay, we can collaborate like this. So the phenomenon we looked at is babies' preference for infant-directed speech, or like baby talk. So, hi, baby, how are you? And that's...
Do we all do that across cultures? That high-pitched,
maybe not across every single culture. There may be a couple that it hasn't been observed in, but it's quite universal around the world, in many, many cultures around the world. So the idea was, okay, let's test this in babies around the world and test this in as many babies we can. So we, and we started in 2015. This was pre-pandemic. I mean, we were on Zoom before it was called Zoom, right? And literally scientists across time zones sitting together arguing about how are we going to do this? How long will we play these sounds to the baby? What language should this baby talk be in? How are we going to measure what we're doing? So we planned this study together. We planned exactly how we're going to analyze it. So, okay, well, what defines a fussy baby? What exactly are the analyses? And we took all that and we did something that's called a pre-registration. So that's when you kind of upload this to a repository. It's time-stamped and it becomes public eventually. Okay. So everyone could see our plan. We had this plan, everyone could see it. We submitted it to a journal in what's called a registered report. So they agreed, like, okay, your plan is good, it's sound. Whatever happens, we're going to publish this. And then we did the study. These dozens of labs did the study, and nearly 3,000 babies contribute. I mean, compare 16 to 3,000. Yeah. It's nuts. And we collaboratively wrote this document. So we wrote an article, and literally dozens of people on Google Documents at different times of day in different time zones, writing these documents, a whole analysis team analyzing these data, and we ended up with this publication with these hundreds of authors.
Wow.
So it's pretty amazing.
How wide-ranging was this? Was it different socioeconomic context as well? Did you have countries in the global south? And also, I guess, what language was the language of communication for the research?
Right.
Because speaking in German or French or English will determine how the research is thought.
Yeah, so these were all deep questions that we tackled as part of our collaboration. So diversity is one really important issue. So I have to say that for our first project, we didn't get the diversity that we ultimately hoped to get. So certainly it's the case, the parents who are able to come to our labs, and that's where we test the babies and play them the sounds, typically they're more well-off families. They have the time to do this. They have the interest. So it's hard to get that diversity, although certainly many labs make many efforts to recruit those families and invite them to participate. And in terms of the lab participation, we had labs around the world, but it was primarily from the global north, especially North American and European institutions. Now we're making great strides to try to bring in more diversity. So we had a grant from the Jacobs Foundation that allowed us to invite collaborators from around Africa. And so they weren't able to join in time for that original study, but they are now replicating this study with the populations of their learners there. We have new initiatives in South America as well. We're inviting new labs. So we're trying to recruit new labs. And not all these places have the same types of research infrastructure, the same types of resources that we have, and the same history of doing this particular type of experimental research. So we found out from our collaborators in Africa that the developmental psychologists have been more involved in health-oriented research and population questionnaires, other types of research may be different from what we're doing. So we've been reaching out to them, seeing if they're interested. Do they, want training on this, and also what can they contribute to future projects? What ideas do they have? Inviting them to really join the conversation.
That's great. It's amazing. It really has a global reach.
Yeah, and that's one of our goals as Many Babies is to increase the diversity of participants, of ideas, of researchers as well, and just increase capacity.
Thank you. And you alluded to the Many Babies project leading to your basically thinking about and investing open science.
Yes.
Can you define what open science is? It's this huge term, right? And
yes.
I think of the FAIR principles, and a few concepts come up, but can you talk us through open science? What this is, what this means?
Yeah, so it means a lot of different things. So on the one hand, it's a movement, it's a change in science from a more closed model that's been traditional, right? And that comes with new practices. So traditionally, if we think about how science was done, well, it was done in people's laboratories with their students. Right. Maybe I'm going to record some sounds to play to the babies. Well, those sounds are going to be kept on my servers in my lab. If you want them, maybe you can email me about it, but I might not send them to you. Yeah. I'm going to analyze my data. My data is going to be kept on my computer. I publish it in a journal. You only have access to that publication if your library subscribes maybe to that journal. So, good luck to you if they don't. And say you wonder, I wonder if I could reproduce those analyses. Tough luck. In the traditional model, you don't have access to that data. And a lot of people would be surprised by that. A lot of people think, scientists must be able to look at each other's data and check that it makes sense and maybe try another analysis. And traditionally, that hasn't been the case, at least in psychology and many other disciplines. So open science encompasses many practices and approaches just for making science more open. So everything from FAIR principles, so this is data reuse, so having access to the original data as much as possible when that's possible. Of course, there are issues related to privacy and anonymity, but to the extent we can. And so, for example, the Many Babies data, anybody can download that. That's fully anonymized. It's available on the web, and actually a lot of, we know of some people who are using that for teaching, for example. So they're teaching a stats class. Hey, why not download the Many Babies data and try it out.
And is this the raw data, or this is cleaned up data?
Well, some of it has been cleaned and some of it hasn't. Okay. So it's actually, that's a great exercise as well for students to clean up some aspects of that data that haven't been cleaned. How do you clean the data?
In your field.
Well, so what data cleaning typically means, it has to do with checking the data. So there can be errors introduced in the data. Someone types in 100 instead of 10. Do the range of values make sense? If a baby is listed as being, that these babies are under 1 year old, but a baby has 400 months old. Okay, there's something wrong with that. Maybe it was 4 months old or something like that. So cleaning the data is checking it, make sure it makes sense.
Right. And if there's some slight flaw in the design, you just let it play out and then just see what happens? Or did you adjust? Because this is a huge project.
It's a huge project.
Hundreds of labs.
Right. So there's the question on the research design, which is sort of what we plan to show to the babies, how we plan to analyze that. So that was checked by many, many people, and that's good. Then, of course, there's the data that comes in, and so we check that to the extent possible. If we identify things that are questionable, so here's an example. In this study, we measured babies looking to a screen. That was our main variable. And we know when babies are interested in something, they look. So if they looked more to just a geometric image when they heard this baby talk, more than when they heard this adult talk, that means they like the baby talk. So our main measure, looking, okay? Well, you could measure looking in seconds, or you could measure looking in milliseconds. We had all the labs upload their files, but for some of them, the numbers were in the thousands, and for some of them, they were in the ones. Typically, the trials were 20 seconds. So it had to be less than 20 seconds looking, or the equivalent in milliseconds. So if we see that one data file, those numbers are suspicious, we can go back to that original lab and check with them, like, oh, did you put this in seconds rather than milliseconds, for example. So to some degree, we can check on those things. Some values just are completely implausible, and we can't go back. We can't figure out where the error came from. We might just delete that value and just say that it's a missing data point. We're pretty sure this data point is not correct. It doesn't make any sense at all. We can start missing. So there are different approaches that you can take. But what's actually one thing that's really important in open science is to be very transparent about that. So the way that we actually cleaned up those data in many babies was through a computer script where there'd be instructions like, okay, well, if it has this this certain implausible data range, delete this. If this happened, do that. And so anyone can go back and look, okay, how did you clean this data? Well, and then if you decided, well, I don't like how you clean the data, I disagree, you could clean the data in another way. And so you can check, do our results depend on how we clean the data, how we analyze that? Could you find something else if you did it another way? So that's what makes it really open and transparent. Everyone can see what happened, and if you disagree or want to try something out, you're free to do so.
Because you have access to both the raw data, the clean data.
Yes.
And so following the principles, I guess coming back to the FAIR principles, you've got feasibility, what's A again? The I is interoperability.
Yes.
So this is basically an example of that?
The FAIR principles have to do with how you store data rather than necessarily how you analyze it.
Okay, yeah.
So an example in many babies is that we store the data in CSV files. These are an open, comma-separated value file. Any computer can read that. We could have stored the data in an Excel format. Well, Excel is proprietary. Not everybody has Excel. Maybe in 100 years, Excel, no one will know what Excel is.
In 10 years, maybe?
Maybe in 10 years.
Given that how technology changes constantly.
Yeah, so this is an example of FAIR data, choosing a data format that's going to be interoperable in this sense.
And could you talk about some of the challenges? Because I'm seeing like so many possibilities in discussing open science.
Yes.
And I see absolutely how you've used it in a perfectly coherent manner with this project, and you sort of had to across hundreds of labs or 200 labs. But you also had a common data set or a mise en commun, commoning of the data set. You had very structured research questions across the board. What happens when someone comes in from another discipline or has a different take on whatever you're looking at? What do they make of this data? And is there any sense that they might use it, maybe not nefariously, but use it in ways that doesn't necessarily correspond to the original design?
Yeah, that's definitely a risk of open data, that once you open up your data, you no longer control it. And I think some people are worried about that control and data being misused. And I think there are certainly cases, and it depends what kind of data it is, that might be a reason not to make data open if it's very sensitive type of data, for example. In this case, it's data on how long babies look to a screen. It's hard to think. But nonetheless, one way we can protect against that is really documenting our data. So our data is organized in different columns. What exactly is in those columns, right? So someone doesn't misinterpret. Say we have a baby's gender, and you can imagine it could be coded 0 and 1, for example, in a data set. What was 0 and what was 1? If someone gets it completely backwards, they're going to maybe make a wrong conclusion. So in that case, we have to document what our data mean, what it represents, and hopefully other users could, use it, correctly as much as possible.
So there's an additional, if I understand well, there's an additional labor involved as well with this approach?
Yes, that is true. So this kind of data that I'm talking about is called metadata. So it's data about the data. And so yes, that is something that's really important in open science and something that we do in our lab as well. So in each of our projects with my students, we also strive to have open data and to publish the data. Right. It's another step to make sure, okay, could someone else read this data set and know what's going on? Is the metadata there to explain it?
And is there a whole discourse around the metadata in the sense that, religious studies used to study the holy text, and then there was exegesis and the writings on writings on writings. Do you see this happening as well?
I mean, I haven't seen it happening so much. Certainly, we're getting used to what the best practices are for metadata. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily have as many standards as we want. So, my data on looking times, one person might name their column looking time, another LT, another infant gaze, right? So it'd be nice if we all labeled it the same thing. So that's definitely coming. Now, in terms of the question of, is this an extra step? Is this extra work? Because a lot of people worry open science creates extra work, right? And an extra burden.
Something extra funding for it?
Well, I mean, this is there is not, as far as I've seen. But what I can say is that the biggest user of these good practices and metadata is my future self, right? So when I go back to that data set for some reason in 5 years, and I'm like, what was 0 and what was 1? Right. I don't remember. If I've taken the time with my students to document that and to create that metadata, it's useful to me. Mm-hmm. Later on. So it's really just a good form of practice that, in fact, benefits that person as well. Of course, you're doing that work up front a little bit rather than in 5 years spending way more time to figure out what the heck you did. But really, overall, I don't think it adds so much burden that people might worry about.
And I guess that model follows or basically frames the type of research you've been doing for a long time, so it doesn't necessarily change the nature of your research.
No, I wouldn't say that these practices change the nature of our research. And one thing that we've learned in doing different types of projects, so we have sort of experiments like this where we show babies things and we measure their reactions, but we have other kinds of studies where we videotape families interacting together, and we code, okay, who's speaking which language and what does the baby do and this kind of thing.
It's your bilingual work.
This is our bilingual work. And those types of projects, they invite different open science practices. Mm-hmm. So, for example, with the families, I'm not going to take their videos and just post them on YouTube without their permission. Right. Versus anonymized data that couldn't be associated with an infant. Yeah, I can post that online. Of course, we have the ethics approvals, but there's really no concern about that. So I can't be quite as open with those videos. It's not the case that another researcher could just easily, without talking to me, reproduce my results because they might not have access to the data. Now, we do ask the families, would you like to share your data? There's different levels, and the families themselves can agree to different levels of sharing that they feel comfortable with. So some feel, oh yeah, you could share my video anywhere you want, I don't mind, YouTube, the internet is fine. Others might say, oh, you could share it with other scientists who have the training, I'm comfortable with that. Others would say, no, just keep it in your lab, I'm most comfortable with that. And that also puts power into the hands of research participants to decide, how far do they want this to go. Some are really into sharing and openness and see that their contribution could be very large in that way. Others, want more privacy. So it's going to be different types of open science practices for different projects that we have, and I think this extends across all areas of scholarship, that it's not going to be the same thing for every type of discipline and even projects within disciplines.
Yeah. So in May, I think last May, you organized a research day or a day of discussions around open science.
Yes.
Could you talk a bit about how that went, what you were attempting to do, what you wanted to do, who you wanted to attract to the conversation, and what came out of it?
Yeah, this was a really fun day that we had. I have to give a lot of credit to my Horizon postdoctoral fellow, Nicholas Alessandroni, who did a lot of the organizing and who is an expert in doing his postdoc in open science. And our vision for that day was to really bring together scholars across Concordia, especially from, I'd say most of them were from the Faculty of Arts and Science, but we were very open to anyone from around the university to really start and continue a dialogue at Concordia about open science. So open science is not something that everybody knows about, or even if people know about it, they may feel uncertain, scared. There's certain mandates coming from granting agencies. So for example, our Quebec agencies are mandating open access publications, that there should be availability of those publications. There's other mandates coming. And so we wanted to start talking about that at Concordia and how, from everything to how are we going to support open science, data storage? How are we going to train our students? What are people doing on open science? It was amazing to us how much open science is happening at Concordia, how many researchers are working on this without knowing each other, talking to each other, because we're from different departments. So that was the really fun part as well, to really see what's happening, see the enthusiasm, and actually sort of coming from this, and I say scientists and researchers, also librarians. Librarians at Concordia have been doing a fantastic job on so many aspects of, especially open access, open educational resources. So they're real key players in this as well. And so out of this, we've actually formed an open science working group at Concordia.
Okay.
And we're going to start meeting
across the disciplines and
across the disciplines, across
yeah.
faculty, including students, faculty, and librarians,
Okay.
to really start I could continue this conversation about open science at Concordia, looking, towards the future. This is something that Concordia needs to take really seriously, because as much as it's kind of a bottom-up movement right now, individual people embracing it, it's also coming from the top down.
Right, it's being imposed.
It's being imposed as well.
Yeah.
So we need to get ahead of things. We need to be on the ball with this and creating our own culture of open science, so that we can also set the agenda, set our own agenda, rather than having it set for us.
What are the points of resistance? I can think of a few when you mention open access. Generally, the principle is great, but then you have researchers who pay to publish their articles in high-ranking journals, and the libraries where the professors are teaching have to pay for access for that same article. So you're paying twice, and the various ranking systems, algorithms are often connected to some of the publishers as well. So there's an existing system that seems to emphasize a certain approach, right? A proprietary approach to research. And if FRQ, the Quebec the Quebec funding agency and eventually the federal funding impose open access, what does this mean to professors ranking internationally, to collaborative publications with colleagues in countries where that isn't being imposed?
Yeah, I think this is part of sometimes what I see as a false dichotomy between sort of the old way of doing it and all the good things about that, and this new open science thing, and you can't have both. And I actually think you can have both, and we might have both.
How so?
For a while. So as an example, sort of one of the rules that we follow because of the agencies, but also because we value it, is open access, that when we publish a scientific article, that should be available to anyone. Now, how can we accomplish this? Well, we can use other mechanisms. So for example, we use what's called preprints. So there are servers online. We take not the final copy edited version, but the Microsoft Word version, for example, the PDF, upload it to these servers, and then it is available to anyone. At the same time, we might have good reasons to want to publish it into a prestigious journal or a journal that's widely read that may or may not be an open access journal. And so it's not the case that we only publish in open access journals in my lab. Sometimes we do when that's the best venue. Sometimes we don't, but we always upload the preprint. Okay. And I think as open science comes, I think there might be a shift in which journals are prestigious as well. And so as that cultural shift happens, I think it will be very natural for people to follow. I don't expect people to forget prestige and forget what their colleagues are reading, right? Yeah. But we can do other things at the same time to ensure that there is access.
Okay, but in my field, we were publishing a book with an academic press, and they said after 18 months we can make it open access, but we stopped printing the book as of that point. So
right,
we're finding solutions, right?
So absolutely.
The book will exist and will be bought by libraries, but readers will have access to it. Students especially will have access to it.
Right.
Otherwise, what are some of the other points of resistance that, or resistance in the wide sense? It doesn't, sort of things that still need to be ironed out as we think through this model.
There's a lot of discomfort around sharing data, I would say, in my field, and even myself, I felt very nervous about it the first time. Yeah. People have a lot of worries. So one worry is like, oh my gosh, what if someone finds a mistake? In my data, and mistakes happen. Of course. What if someone finds a mistake? What if I've done something wrong? And this has actually happened to me. So, one of the first times we shared some data, it actually turned out that fortunately it was not the data analysis or the conclusions, but actually one of the figures did have an error in that just because of the way we'd written the code, it was a little bit off, not wildly off, but off. And you know what? We would have never known, except for that data was open. A group of curious graduate students and postdocs wanted to reproduce that figure. They couldn't reproduce it. They said, hey, what's going on? They emailed us. We talked about it. We figured it out. And we issued a correction to the journal. It was not a big deal. And that taught me that, what is the worst that can happen? Actually, I think the worst that can happen is the scientific record is wrong and can't be corrected, right? Isn't it better to know that it's an error? I mean, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to have made an error. But if you have, isn't it better to know about it and to correct it? And can we change the culture so that this isn't a huge embarrassing thing? This is something you try your best, but it just happens, these errors, we own them, we correct them, and then we move on to the next and hopefully don't make it again.
You can write an article on correcting that error and thinking about the positive impact of having access to data.
Yes, exactly. People do worry about that. People worry, some people like to reuse their data for multiple projects, so they worry, well, what happens if I share all this data set and I get scooped? Someone else kind of takes takes this from me. The strategy that we've had, so for example, I had a large collaboration where we collected survey data from nearly 1,000 parents who are raising multilingual kids in Quebec. And this had many parts of the survey, so it was going to end up being multiple papers. So what we did is we didn't share all of the data immediately. We shared just the data that you needed to reproduce the analyses for the first paper, then the data for the second paper, then the third paper. Once we were done with our papers, then we reunited the entire data set so that maybe someone can do an analysis that we didn't think of. So again, it's not all or nothing, right? It's not, you have to post your entire data set necessarily all at once. It might be you can do it incrementally.
Right. Well, this opens up, I guess, an interesting conversation around people in your lab, mentorship. So you mentioned you have four postdocs, multiple grad students, and undergrads, and they all have access to the same data sets. More or less.
Well, so typically, typically each one spearheads their own project, and so they're collecting, their own data set. But once our projects reach the point of publication, then our sort of lab policy is to share that data. So then it's posted online for anyone to reuse. Yeah,
and how do you mentor students? What are the steps? What are the principles?
I guess there's two things. There's sort of the mentorship in open science, and then there's the mentorship in the field. If I can talk about the open science perspective first, one way I've thought of it is, I came to open science later in life. I was a fully trained researcher. I was a faculty member, and of course, I'm a language researcher. So open science is like a second language to me, right? It's something I had to learn after this closed way of doing things. For them, open science is their first language, their native language. They can't imagine doing it another way. They're thinking, why wouldn't we do these practices? So, it's part of the lab culture. They come in, it's expected, and there's no resistance. There's no concerns. They just know that this is the way that things are done. So I think that's an important part of fostering open science, is just to make it, the water you swim in. But when it comes to sort of the rest of that mentorship, something that's been really important, I would say for me, is something that we have in a lot of the sciences and some of the social sciences is a lab culture. So a real group culture where students support each other, they help each other, they mentor each other, I mentor them, but also a really positive atmosphere. So that's something that's really important to me, is that it be collaborative, not competitive. And that's something that I look for even when I recruit students to join my lab. I'm looking for students who have a collaborative spirit. And in fact, when I'm interviewing prospective graduate students or postdoctoral fellows, I often do the first round of interviews, but then I have the lab interview them. And if the lab tells me, I'm not sure about this person, they don't seem to have this spirit, then I would really hesitate before bringing them into the lab. So we are looking for people who are diverse in their backgrounds, whether it's theoretical, whether it's internationally, but there is that common flame of collaboration, curiosity, motivation, conscientiousness, these positive attributes that I think make a good scientist, but also someone who I want to work with. So that's the first piece is recruiting good people, and good people are attracted where the good people already are. So that's a really fun part of it too, is that these prospective lab members in meeting the rest of the lab, if they have that spirit themselves, are going to be attracted and say, wow, this is a great place to work. I want to join this. So it builds upon itself.
Well, it certainly does sound like a great environment that's fostering collaboration and really open-mindedness. One last question: what drives you right now with your research? What is like the impetus?
Yeah, I mean, so many unanswered questions, so many things. I'm motivated by my trainees and the questions that they're asking, and I'm motivated by the parents I see who have questions about raising their own bilingual children. So this is the kind of research we're doing to understand early bilingualism. So to answer these questions, but to answer them in an open way where science can build upon itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we have a few minutes for questions, if there are any online or in-house. Anna will field the online questions. No questions online?
I'm not seeing anything, but don't be shy, folks. If you'd like to jump in, I do see a raised hand now. See, that's all it took, that extra 20 seconds.
We just have to be patient and wait, yeah.
It's a friendly face.
How are you?
It's a friendly face with friendly comments. So, yes, but thank you, Krista, and thank you, Patrick. Very stimulating. I recognize my colleagues' enthusiasm and dedication, which we share. Now, I have a question, playing the devil advocate, and I think we did discuss this at the Open Science Symposium 2 months ago. What are the downsides of dissemination of preprint? There is a little bit of the dark side or risk factor associated with this. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so just to remind everyone what preprints are. So preprints is actually one of my lab's open science practice, which is sharing a version of the manuscript even before it is peer-reviewed, so before publication.
Before peer review,
yes.
So someone could come in and extract.
Yeah, so we do
Yeah.
this systematically in my lab. So either at the time or prior to submission, we post this preprint online where anyone can see it. And in fact, the peer review process is very long, as many of us know, but this makes that knowledge accessible even before that has been completed. So I think there's some major upsides of this. So, people can access this knowledge as soon as possible. You can get feedback on it, not just from your peer reviewers as well, from anyone online who might drop you a message. But as this is their colleague in the department, Dr. Diane Poulin-Dubois, as she alludes, there are some drawbacks or concerns that could come. So it hasn't been peer reviewed. And so during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a lot of journalists looking at preprints, early, things that are not peer-reviewed yet.
Right.
And so that peer review system is there for a reason, to catch problems, half-baked ideas, mistakes. And so we have to be careful with preprints to not think of them as quite the same as peer-reviewed articles, right? They are knowledge, they're information, they can contribute, but ultimately I think peer review is still going to remain our gold standard.
I agree. I think what we want is citing a preprint is risky because the data are not reviewed by peers, but at the same time, it gives you a feel for what's going on, the hot stuff,
That's
and
right.
what people have done, and you don't want to do the same. And also, often in the preprint format, you're invited to comment on the preprint, so that you help the authors to improve their manuscript.
In your field, are there preprints that remain preprints and are never peer-reviewed, published in peer-reviewed journals?
So I think this can happen in any field. So I myself even have this one niggling preprint that it's a manuscript that was peer-reviewed. It was rejected. It does need some work. We haven't had that. No, we actually haven't had the time to really properly address those comments. We need new analyses. So it's been remaining a preprint longer than I would like. I think you do have to think of a shelf life for a preprint. So if you see a preprint that's pretty new, and there's no peer-reviewed version, okay. If you see one that's quite old and there's still no peer-reviewed version, take that with a grain of salt. Think about why that might be, or even contact the authors to ask, you know, what happened to this? Did you drop this idea? Did it go through? You know, maybe you can get more information, because you do want to be cautious about it. But there are people who, you know, for example, you know, preprint some things that they never intend for peer review. They might just be ideas that they want to express and
like
just
a
kind of
white paper. You see
Yeah,
that in
similar-
management.
yeah.
It's a great statement. I will be working on this.
Yes, like
Here's
a
some
white paper or
ideas.
some preliminary ideas you just kind of wanted to get out there, and you have to, you know, like all literature or gray literature or posters at conferences or talks, you know, you have to weigh that evidence with the force that it should have.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for your question. I'm told that our time is up, so thank you again for being such a lively, enthusiastic, and engaging participant in this series of talks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Patrick.
All right, and a round of applause, I guess. Thanks so much, Krista, for joining us here today, and the folks who are here with us in person as well. For the folks on the Zoom, I'll just let you know that you can hang out here. You can just stay in the space with us for the next few minutes as we get set up for the next conversation to start at 2 p.m. Otherwise, jump back on later if you'd like. And we'll pause the live stream now and restart at 2 p.m. Thanks, Maximus, for that. Okay, see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.